I'm Damian Jones from the Irrigated Cropping Council. I'm going to run through basically it's going to be a discussion. Part one is about principally looking at the decisions about pre-irrigation. And part two is then what happens if we make certain decisions in the autumn and what impact that has coming into spring. And then to sort of round off, I'll use a little gross margin tool that you may have seen before. It's pretty simple, but it gives us the ability to look at, well, you know, is it worthwhile irrigating, setting up crops for irrigation, particularly in the spring, given the price outlooks that we've been given so far today. So I emphasise this as a discussion because I'm going to throw up some ideas and put in some figures. You may totally disagree with it. That's great. We can have that discussion. If you totally agree with it, that's even better. So starting with pre-irrigation, obviously if it's worthwhile, the current price of water makes a big part of that decision. And where you've heard that it's roughly somewhere around 450, 500, cruising around there at the moment. The next decision is to whether I should be pre-irrigating or not is when is the break. Now I was hoping Dale Gray was going to tell us that, but he refused. He just said it's going to be an act of weather, not there's going to be no signs about, the break is going to be on this day. But historically, I'm based in Kerrang, we've sort of, after looking at the statistical data, that we really don't expect a break till the third week of May. Now, seeing as I've come over to the east to the high rainfall area, would your estimate of when the break is, what would that be? Mid-May? At Stanhope this morning, they even went even worse. They thought mid-June. But yeah, you've got to have a realistic expectation about when that break is going to be, because there's still quite a few people around Kerrang who still believe it's Anzac Day. But it may have been Anzac Day about 50 years ago, because there's a bloke called Michael Cashin at New South Wales DPI who studied, when he was involved in the climate change debate, but he was looking at, what's happened with our weather, particularly when that break's starting to occur. So after looking at the data, he came up with the suggestion that the break's probably shifted 7 days later every 10 years for the last 40 or 50 years. So that's, at one stage it probably quite accurately was Anzac Day, but over time it's actually shifted further and further into May. So that forms a very significant part of your decision whether you're going to pre-irrigate or not. If you don't believe there's going to be a break at all, then that obviously means that pre-irrigation is going to be essential to get your crop up and going. Also the flexibility of, I'll put up there the flexibility of the crop to sowing date, and originally the intention was that the cereals are probably a little bit more flexible in terms of if they're going a little bit late, depending on the spring, the yield decline is probably, they're going to be a bit more forgiving compared to particularly the canola and faba beans. But I also thought that the cereals do offer us a few more options in terms of, traditionally I sow a mid-late variety, first week of May, after pre-irrigation and irrigated in spring. But, there's a broad range of cereal maturities out there. So if we decide not to pre-irrigate and we end up, sowing later in May, maybe we have to shift from a mid-late variety and go out with a shorty that may not get the yield reduction that something a bit longer season might end up with. So the cereals have got that advantage, but unfortunately canola does to a degree, but whether you can actually source seed is another thing. Last couple of years it's been, you've had to have your seed orders by November, and there's not really much flexibility in it. And in terms of faba beans, really the difference between the varieties out there is bugger all, so you're basically stuck with that maturity. I'll talk a little bit more about the yield penalty from late sowing in a second. Commodity prices in spring form a big part of, particularly if we are going to do irrigated cropping or cropping in general, we've got to have a bit of an idea of what those things are going to be worth in spring. Colin threw up some ideas, but it is an educated guess. at this stage. Who predicted that faba beans would be $1,000 a tonne this time last year? And if everyone puts up their hand, I'm going to call them a liar anyway. But yeah, so things change. So yeah, in some ways, a gross margin about whether it's going to be worthwhile or not is a little bit of an educated guess, but hopefully we get a bit of education in our guess. And the last thing is the availability of water in spring, particularly, you know, from my own perspective, our little trial block at Kerrang this year is due to grow faba beans. Now, we've got water to cover our pre-irrigation, but we're thinking, well, if we grow faba beans under pre-irrigation, we're committing ourselves to 3, maybe 4 irrigations next spring. So is that going to be economically worthwhile? And as well as sort of those economic aspects to it, there's also some agronomic aspects to pre-irrigation. So once again, I'm going to hark back to our little trial farm at Kerrang. We do have a Group A hot ryegrass resistance issue. So pre-irrigation is probably our number one stage of our weed management, in that by giving a pre-irrigation, we get that germination early, we can get it knocked down before we go and sow our crops. Another aspect to that is the crop competition. If we get crops away early, they're competitive, they can potentially compete against some weeds. And this was highlighted to me from some work John Fowler, the ex-DA from Denny, New South Wales DPI, did. He was doing some survey work of Group A resistant ryegrass across irrigation farms through that Deniliquin district. And one of the sites that he picked is, well, you know, good grower, always pre-irrigates, does everything by the book. And when he actually tested the ryegrass plants, he had a very high rate of Group A resistance. And the farmer said, I don't believe that is the case, or words to that effect. And it was simply because he'd never seen ryegrass being an issue in his crop, simply because he was growing Rosella, soft wheat, so got a bit of winter habit, so he'd always started early. The crop would bounce out of the ground, moisture, warmth, everything. So it'd get established and get that canopy cover, and didn't give the ryegrass a chance. But when you got the ryegrass out on their own, that's when they began to dominate. So next bit, risk of rainfall. So anyone remember 2017? We pre-irrigated, we got really wet, we had to re-sow. So there's those seasons where pre-irrigation is not going to be the thing, and that rainfall wasn't predicted. Conversely, if it's too dry, that we're not going to get the crop that we need for a spring irrigation that's going to respond to spring irrigation. So in terms of spring irrigation, if I had the preference of using a meg in the autumn or a meg in the spring, you get far more bang for your megalitre in that spring response that we'll get from crops. But given that but you've got to have the crop there to be able to respond to that megalitre that you get. So you've got to have either shoots per square metre, heads per square metre, biomass in terms of canola, and you've got to have a nitrogen status in your crop that can actually respond to water. We've recently done some work on behalf of GRDC surveying a range of irrigated crops from Kerrang through up into Griffith, and the crops that produced poorly last year were the ones that weren't pre-irrigated, simply because they never got going. They came up on marginal moisture, not a lot of rainfall through June, July, so the crops never got up until it. So they sat there as 1 or 2 shoot plants. You get to spring, they've stopped tillering, so what you've got is what you've got. Irrigation isn't going to create a good crop from a poorly established crop. So you've got to have the crop there, and that's where sort of, you know, pre-irrigation comes into its own. The other aspect to think about pre-irrigation or not is if you don't pre-irrigate, then in most seasons we're not going to have a lot of moisture in the soil coming into the spring. Usually when we pre-irrigate, we saturate the whole profile so the plant's got a lot of moisture to draw off. If we rely on rainfall, we may, you know, last year it was about that deep. Given the normal year, we get some moisture to death, but not a lot. So once we start getting into August, early September, days are starting to warm up, plants are starting to use quite a bit of moisture, and you just don't have that buffer there that you would have normally expected if you'd pre-irrigated. So that's if if things work out and it's worthwhile irrigating in the spring, you've got to be ready to start as soon as that crop needs it, and it can't be dragged out. So I'm going to run through a couple of scenarios, but these are the assumptions behind the scenarios. One is trying to work out exactly if I am late in sowing due to having to wait for rain, what's the yield penalty I'm going to have to take. Now, a lot of this data is based on dry land. So two things that upset dryland crops: heat in spring and drought. Heat during grain fill affects us too, but hopefully we can do something about the drought. So when I say that the literature suggests that we get 6% yield loss per week if we delay sowing past the optimum date, then as I said, that's a dry land figure. So maybe we're not quite as negative in irrigation. Similarly for canola. The data suggests 10%. I couldn't find any data for faba beans, but drawing on our own experience at Kerrang, we had a 2012 trial where we missed the sowing, we missed the moisture for some reason. So we had a crop that was sown May 10th, really didn't start coming up till mid-June when we got a bit of rain, and then it sort of came good by the end of June. And in that situation, we lost 40% of our yield. So late sowing with fabas can be very detrimental to profitability. As I said, we'll use the water is $500. It's about right, and it makes the maths easy. And if we're pre-irrigating, we're going to use somewhere between 1 and 2 megs. Now, is that a reasonable assumption for here, or you're probably a little bit on the closer to 1 than 2? All right, well, I'll keep that in mind as we go through. So, scenario 1, we're going to go with cereal. We're going to pre-irrigate, so we're going to either pre-irrigate using about 1.5 megs, maybe a meg, sown on May the 4th. Anyone know the relevance of that day? Apart from our target is, our recommended practice for irrigated wheat is sow in the first week of May. No Star Wars fans here. And we're targeting 6 tonnes per hectare. So that's basically our standard recipe for a conservative irrigated crop. Or we're going to wait and sow on June the 4th, and that's a pretty special day. That's my birthday. So we've delayed sowing by about 3 weeks. It's 4 weeks. So we're possibly 18% yield loss, or that equates to about 18% of 6 is about a tonne. So in this situation, if you believe particularly this bit, that we've spent $750 in water for this 1.5 megs, and we've lost $330 of production, or the other way of looking at it, we spent $750 to gain a tonne of production, so $330 a hectare. So in that scenario, it's probably not a good investment. That's assuming that we do get a 5-tonne crop out of this one. Canola, very similar, 1.5 megs, April 24th, targeting 3 tonnes. Or we sow on June the 4th, so I'm going to be busy on my birthday. Potentially a 30% yield loss, or a tonne to the hectare. So in that situation, the $750 we spent on water, or maybe closer to $500 or $600 for yourselves, we've lost a tonne, so around about $500, $525 worth of canola. Or we've spent $750 to give us $525. So once again, canola's not looking real flash either. Grazing cereals. Now, I sort of half heard the question, so hopefully this answers it, but if I don't answer it, ask it again. We did some stuff a long time ago with the dairy team, so sort of 2008, 2009, 2010. And we were looking at, at that stage, a bit of a similar scenario. People had gone out of permanent pastures and were looking to look at either going back at annual pastures or using some of the cereals as a grazing rather than for grain. So in this data, if we're sowing April sowing, the normal cereals, so the ones you typically sow for grain, would produce about 3 to 3.5 tonnes of dry matter by mid to late July. So water them up here in April. We usually got away without having to give them another water. And why mid to late July? Because that's the stage where they start to go into stem elongation. So if you want to do anything with them in terms of hay or grain, that's when you had to get stock off them. So about that. And that also makes sure that you've got enough fertility to drive that as well. Now, the alternative is that we're playing with at the time was the dual purpose cereals. Everything's dual purpose, but these get marketed as such. So they're the true winter wheats, red wheats, and some of the true winter triticales. Now, they produced up to 5 tonnes to the hectare, and a lot later, because they need that cold requirement to flip them over from growing leaves to starting to run the stem up, then some of these things don't really start to go into stem elongation until early September, even mid-September for some of the real late material. So that's where we got the extra tonnage from, was more the winter production, because they were extremely slow at getting going in the autumn. When we were doing these trials, so these things, probably by the time they got up this high, there was about a tonne of dry matter there as a cut or graze, whereas these things had about 300 kilos. So just that slow at getting going. The other thing was, why haven't I got some March data? Because we did try some stuff in March, really helped with these things, but we also had some ryegrass in there. And we also learned that rabbits prefer ryegrass than cereals. So unfortunately, we didn't have any ryegrass data. And the other thing we noticed was the high soil temperatures particularly in that March period. We were trying it, we basically put ryegrass in and then an oat, triticale, wheat, and what have I missed? Barley. When we started sowing March 4th, the daily soil temperatures were still getting up to about 32 degrees, so dry soil. We sowed, we irrigated. First thing was that as soon as after irrigation, as soon as the soil's not wet, like saturated, that basically soil temperatures bump straight back up to what they were when they're. So there was no difference between moist soil and dry soil. So we were getting peaks of up to 32 degrees during the day. So looking at that and seeing our oat plots weren't real flash, we actually did a bit of an experiment, and we involved the kids from the Kerrang High School, where worst case scenario, we basically put a broad range of cereals, basically anything we could find in the shed, put them in a growth cabinet where we could do 32 degrees for 12 hours, drop to 16, 32, 16, 32. So it's not what happens in the paddock, but we're just trying to see if that high temperature does affect the germination. And the oat we were using at the time was called Outback, and we got about 8% germination under that scenario. But as soon as we drop back down to the 20s, they're fine. So that's just something that there's not a lot of information out there. At the time when we're mucking around with this stuff, we looked at the US, and I can find data on heat temperature of some of the cereals in the US, but we don't have that information in Australia. So that's, just a word of warning. Now, we've got time to do this. You got the Excel sheet? Yeah. Right, so you haven't got Shari hasn't handed them out yet? Okay, well I've got some spares. Right, so you might have got a little, did Shari explain? No, that's all right.
Yeah, so it's a USB, just click on the tab on the side, and plug in the computer. It's got that 50 data on it. It's also got
so if you've been to one of our Crop and Connect things, ICC Crop and Connect things, you've probably seen this thing before, where we've been using it to discuss whether I should be irrigating in the spring. But equally, you can do it to do it at just a basic gross margin. Now, it concentrates more on the yields, price of the commodity, irrigation volume, and the cost per megalitre of water, and it glosses over the other costs. So Agriculture Victoria, have got a more detailed gross margin. So this glosses over some of the other inputs, but at the end of the day, it's how much you grow and how much you sell it for and how much it costs to water it is the big cost factors in it. So if I go back to my scenario where I'm sowing on May the 4th, 310, so this is wheat, irrigated wheat, so 310 as a commodity, as what I'm going to get in spring 2019. I've used 1.5 megs of very expensive water. I have top dressed, and I'm going to use 2 megs of $60 water in the spring. Now, why $60? I'm assuming we're going to get an allocation, and I've had numerous discussions about whether it should be the actual cost that it's costing you versus should it be the opportunity cost of the water at the time. And I also got picked up on yesterday that there's no way known it's going to be 60 because I haven't got enough water, particularly if I'm only going to get 28%, blah, blah, blah. But the beauty of it is that you've got a copy. I'll give you the basics on how it works. You can go home and you can plug your figures into it. So if you think my figures are absolute bullshit, that's fine. You've got a tool that you can put what you think is the realistic situation into it. So, under this scenario, 6 tonne of wheat, 310 a tonne. We're going to use 2 spring irrigations at 120. So the gross margin's about 583 a hectare or 166 a meg. So 2018 was a fantastic season after that, wasn't it? Because the gross margins were about 1,500 last year. And it's, a lot of that money is being chewed up by $750 a megalitre, a hectare with that pre-irrigation. Now I've been asked at everything, what happens if water is $400 in the spring? You all know what's going to happen, don't you? We just lost $100 a hectare.
What if you grow 8 tonnes?
8 tonnes? Are you going to, all right, 8 tonnes, I'm going to have to put more urea on. Am I going to be able to do 8 tonnes with 2 megs? So even if you go 8 tonnes, and that's expensive spring water, do you want to go allocation or expensive spring? That'll do. So you're investing $2,000 a hectare to make 468. So you'd have to...
Not do it.
Not if you did it, you've got to do it really well.
Also, keep in mind, we've got no ownership or land ownership.
Oh, no, and it's a gross margin, never. Unfortunately, because every thing is different, every situation is different.
Net profit per hectare, essentially, you get to 190 with the today, at the end of every year, take like $250 for that just to less than $300.
Look, pure economists would also want the opportunity cost of holding water right and all that sort of stuff. But as I said, you can put in a little line there. So look, there's not a lot of money in it, and if we drop this down, so Colin said that prices are sliding, and Colin's always right. So there's another $250 a hectare off. So are you going to invest $2,000 a hectare to make 228? Now, the alternative, and usually this low yield bit is set up as a, if I don't irrigate, if I sell my water, there we go. Right. So my other scenario was we're going to grow 5 tonne. The price has automatically gone down to 280 because I can link it back because it's linked to the other sheet. So we didn't pre-irrigate. We've used slightly less urea because we're not going to thing. We've used 2 megs again in spring using allocation water. So there's still a reasonable gross margin. But that really hinges on that we get a good winter to be able to set our dry land crop up as something that will respond in the spring. And if it was a winter like 2018, it's just not going to happen. We're going to have a dry land crop in spring. And as I said in those, the surveys that we did, the crops that didn't get a pre-irrigation were sown on a bit of residual moisture, came up in June. They went about 2 3/4 to 3 tonnes. And I thought that was pretty good, looking at some of the crops we walked through. The alternative strategy that we talked about this morning, we said, rightio, it's going to be a dryland crop. So a dryland crop around here, 3 tonne, 2 tonne, 2.5, 3. We'll go 280, but we can play around with that. But if we take our 2 megs that we're going to use and go and sell it, and we're going to get 400 for it, who knows? But if we, so in that situation where we decide, no, we'll go dryland cropping, any irrigation water that we get, which is where we're going to commit 2 megs to this paddock, we're now going to have water sales of $700, so we're getting a gross margin of $1,235 a hectare if we include the water sales. So to me that suggests that we've really got to be careful. We've got to know what we've got, and that there is quite a possibility that we're not going to be irrigated croppers this year, we're going to be irrigation water sellers. Is that, you've all probably done the figures in your head anyway, so I haven't surprised anyone, have I? I know that discussion I was having probably in August was that there's no way we're going to pay $220, 240 at the time, but commodity prices just went through the roof, which then allowed us to make money out of $300 water. But yeah.
So just going back 1 sec.
Yep.
So given what you're saying where the break is getting later, would you not be better to put in a pre-irrigation there and take out your 2 spring?
Yep. Starts to get messy there. So if we, all right. And as I said, the value of you having one of these little things, you can get in here and play to your heart's content. What are we going to yield if we only pre-irrigate? Going to go 4? Are you going to sell still? Well, if we look at, all right, we use no spring water. So we've done it because we love irrigating. Especially at about 4 o'clock in the morning when you've got to swing things up.
Now, back in that first sheet, if we're going to use, was it 1.5 and 2, in 1.5 per and 2 in
Yep.
spring, wouldn't you think that things would be that dry that the wheat price would be better than 280? Like, would it be more?
Oh, do you want to make it 400? Oh,
To make it, yeah, 400?
well,
Just depends.
I don't know.
If you get it back,
We saw that like in November, December last year.
Yeah.
just out of interest.
If we can get 440, yes, it's definitely worthwhile.
That's with our 8 tonnes.
With 8 tonnes, do you want to sneak back to 6?
No one's going to go away.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly.
I was told yesterday, if you don't go for 8, you're not in the game. Yeah. So that tonnage is very critical then. So it's taken it from being $1,500 to $600 a hectare.
You still use the urea? Or the urea back there?
Yeah, I can do that.
Not going to make a lot of difference.
Yeah. I suppose it depends. I've heard Andrew speak 3 times now. We need an exception. All right, we've got this water price with us having 100% and New South Wales having 0. We're going to have to get an exceptional winter to get more than what we've got this year. But the drylanders don't need an exceptional year to get reasonable grain yields. So, yeah, if it's an absolute disaster, I think water will be cheap at 500. I think, seeing as almond guys can pay them. The data I saw from DPI was that they're making $2,000 a hectare, $2,000 a meg. So they've got far deeper pockets than anyone else.
Who was that, sorry?
It was almond guys. So they can come into the market if there's not very much water on the market. 500's nothing. Well, if you're selling, it's probably great. So that's the uncertainty. So that's why I'm a researcher / extension officer and I'm not a farmer.
But to have that tool is pretty good. Just to get that CA
Yep.
and all that. Yeah.
So, as I said, hopefully, if you haven't got a copy, see me. I've got a couple of spares. My phone number's in the front of it, so if you've got any questions about it using or it breaks or something and you want another copy, that's no worries. But basically that's my presentation. So my conclusion was that economically it's very difficult to justify pre-irrigating unless we don't get any rain whatsoever over winter. But there are other aspects to it. There's that weed control aspect, and another one that was brought up to me by a grower I was talking to is that he is going to pre-irrigate probably 5 hectares because he's going to grow his seed crops. So he is guaranteeing he's going to get enough seed and good quality seed for 2020. So he is pre-irrigating and will irrigate in the spring to make sure he's got his seed.
Sorry, the grazing ones you said by the end of winter we'd have 5 tonne.
Yep.
So then what would you expect them from there then to be able to put?
They usually grow about, the true winter wheats will probably grow another anywhere between 12 and 15 tonnes. So you'll end up with a total dry matter yield of about 16, 17 tonnes, assuming irrigation and nitrogen. And they will take an extra 1 or 2 irrigations.
So can we put that in there as a hay price rather than that in the wheat price then? If we're looking at...
So I have
I was just putting the same price for wheat.
Yeah, so if we're, and I suppose last time we had this discussion about these dual purpose crops, the dairy farmers didn't, are you a dairy farmer or a cropper? You possibly ended up with stuff that you didn't want because some of the quality can be poor and...
We're looking silage from that.
Yeah, okay, yeah, yep. No, so let's take some of that out of it.
But it's the grazings that we need between now and the end
Yep.
of July that's going to be crucial. And whether we can get more of that annually, that's
Yeah, yep. And I suppose if you're grazing, you've got the other thing about if it does get wet, they don't handle grazing, pugging like ryegrass does. So there's, if it was easy, everyone would be doing it.
Depends where we'll all be there.
Yes.
Thanks, Damian.
At what point you sort of perhaps make a call, like, you know, some of those figures going to get $100 a hectare, or just not dropping into go summer crop?
Oh, that's, yeah, there is a main.
Very farm by farm scenario. Like, did anyone mention that last seminars that they take that way?
No, because I don't think people have thought that far forward, but they're, but yeah.
No, I mean,
Yeah.
a lot of things can go wrong, but if it's really dry, you dig high and the water will stay about where it is, or possibly a little bit nearer, and then say the summer crop, like the corn crops,
Yeah, yep,
relevant too.
yep. Yeah,
So
that's,
even, like, everyone's proven even a pretty high cost year like this year just gone. Like we're starting to hopefully get towards the end of the corn crop and accepting really hot weather and a few other factors. It was absolutely not that unprofitable to do it.
yeah. Well, when we did these things in spring, yeah, there was still good money to be made out of maize. That was at 400 and 340, 350 for water. Yeah.